Old School Lane Casual Chats is brought to you by oldschoollane.blogspot.com and is associated with Channel Frederator, Manic Expression, The Comic Book Cast, and the Reopened Nickelodeon Studios in Orlando, Florida Facebook page. Hello everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of Casual Chats. I am Patricia, and today we're going to be discussing about Recess in honor of its 20th anniversary, and we have a whole bunch of awesome guests. So joining us from a few years ago, we have back Paul and Joe, the creators of Recess. Welcome back, guys.
Hey.
And we have a whole bunch of new guests coming in. So first introduce some of the writers of Recess. We have with us, we have Bart Jennett. Welcome, Bart.
Thanks for having me.
We have one of the co-creators of All Real Monsters and who also wrote a few episodes of Recess. We have Peter Gaffney. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, thank you, Patricia.
And we have the music composer for Recess. We have Denis Hannigan. Welcome, Denis.
Hello, everybody.
And last but certainly not least, we have one of the voice actors from Recess. He was the voice of Gus Griswold. We have Courtland Mead. Welcome, Courtland.
Hey, thanks, Patricia.
So, yeah, I guess...
Hey, Courtland.
The best speeches.
It's been a while.
So, yeah, I guess we can get started with discussing, let's go way back into the beginning. So, Paul, Joe, so where did the process of Recess started with you working previously on Nickelodeon with Rugrats, then eventually going over to the Disney Channel?
Well, Joe and I, after we had, and by the way, Peter Gaffney also worked extensively on Rugrats.
And Denis Hannigan too.
After we had finished with Rugrats, we all went in kind of different directions. And Joe and I, over a couple of years there, became partners. Joe was working on Hey Arnold, and he wanted to tell a story about kids that was a little more, rather than the romantic side of it. He wanted to show what it really felt like to him and to me to be fourth graders in school, what that experience was really like. And we came up with the idea that it would be cool to do a show about the part of school that we all really remembered. What did we really remember from fourth grade? And we realized that all the good times were, all the stories that we all had were what happened on the playground at Recess. And that's how we came up with the idea.
And how about your side, Joe?
No, that's pretty much what happened. I mean, Paul and I, Paul, like he said, I was working on Arnold, and it's like, you're kind of going round and round thinking of all these different stories, and sometimes I would say, this is not what fourth graders act like. And one night I was asleep, and I just kind of woke up and I thought, the Recess gang, and I got up and I drew a little picture, which, by the way, I'm a terrible artist, but it's was a little sketch, and I called Paul the next morning and I said, I have an idea. What if it's the Recess gang? And Paul said, why do you have gang in the title? Just one word, Recess. And I thought, that's pretty cool. And then Paul had the idea that it would be like almost like have a military theme to it, so that it would be like stamped like MASH or something, so that it had, and that gave it that additional feeling of being like, like the adults are keeping you down, like it's a prisoner of war camp or something. And then that just sparked all these different stories and things. And what we did right away was once we pitched this to Disney and they really liked it, we started calling all our writer buddies, men and women and anybody, and also talking to kids too, but just saying, what are your stories of childhood in school? And what we realized kind of really quickly, which was great about the whole Recess idea, was that most of your story ideas were things like, that happened on the playground, or happened after school or right before school. There were very few stories that were coming out that were like, when I was in class, I remember learning math this one day. It's like that. Usually it was more like, we snuck in the window or something like that, or somebody kicked the ball into the dumpster or something like that. So we started calling guys like Peter and Holly and Bart later and Mark and just saying, tell us stories of your childhood. And that's what sort of sparked all of these things, So that kind of kicks it to Bart and Mark. Mark and Peter were on the phone, too.
I guess we can start off with the writers. So, Bart, how did you first find out about, Paul and Joe's work and going into Recess?
I had been working at late night television for quite a while. This is the late 90s, like 97 or 98. And I knew the show that I was on at that time was the Magic Hour. I don't know if you remember, Magic Johnson actually had a talk show for like 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know what that is. It's, oh my God, it's something.
Yeah, well, the writing was so on the wall the whole time that show was not going to last. I started looking around for jobs, and it just so happened a guy that I'd worked with on a previous show by the name of Phil Walsh was story editing Recess. And I never even thought of working in cartoons at that point in my career, but I called up Phil. He says, "Why don't you come over and pitch us some ideas and see if anything sticks?" So I came over and I pitched a couple of episode ideas. Got one picked up, I think, and was invited back to do some punch up. And within a strangely short amount of time, I was hired as a story editor on Recess. I mean, I really owe these two guys, Joe and Paul, for my career in animation. It's kind of blossomed ever since.
That sounds great. So, Peter, what about from, you going over from All Real Monsters and Rugrats to Recess?
Yeah, I don't remember. But I got to say, I owe Paul Germain my career in animation, too, because when on Rugrats, the day I arrived in L.A., Paul Germain, who I've never heard of, calls me up on the phone and tells me he's doing this show about babies. And I said, "Who are you?" And I think John Payson at MTV had given him my name. And that was the whole beginning of my, career in kids shows. And it's such an amazing piece of synchronicity. It's hard to believe. And it's, I'm really glad that we're still friends, a quarter century later. It's amazing. But, in terms of Recess, I don't remember what happened. I don't remember how I got involved in it, because I had been doing some other things for a little while at least, and I wasn't working on Our Real Monsters, and I don't even know. Do you guys remember how you brought me in? You must have just called me up and said, "Hey, you want to write something?"
We just sort of called you up, right, Paul? I mean, I think we just said, "Hey, let's get Peter. Let's get Rachel Whitman was another one. We brought her in at around that time too, and just said, "Come on over and help us." And you worked on the first season with us, and then I don't remember. Did you work on that the Nightmare Ned show? Peter?
No, what happened was, I don't know when, was Nightmare Ned before or after? It must have been before. It must have been before.
I think it's kind of happening right before, and in fact, Courtland, who's also on the phone, was Nightmare Ned. Weren't you, Courtland?
Yeah, I played Ned Needlemeyer. I also got to the video game, the PC video game a long time ago. So that's my first project I got to work on with Paul and Joe, and then just ended up, I think, working on Lloyd in Space as well. So
Lloyd in Space was quite a bit later, but I don't think Joe and I worked on Nightmare Ned. We may have heard your name mentioned or something, and maybe that's when we.
It might have been Oscar's Atlas. It was so long ago. Thinking back.
But Peter was working on Nightmare Ned. Because what happened is when Jerry Laybourne and Barry Blumberg and all those guys decided, they were the execs at Disney, and they decided they wanted, a bunch of, at that point, Nickelodeon had exploded on the scene, doing all this really different, interesting kind of animation. And Disney was thinking, we want to do that. And so they were reaching out to people like us who had been doing stuff like Rugrats and Hey Arnold and stuff, and they said, and All Real Monsters, and said, "Come on over and work over here." And so Peter was working at Disney right when we were about to start Recess. So it was the perfect thing because we'd work with him on Rugrats. So that was an easy thing to come on over and sort of like, if you got some time, come on over. And then I can't remember exactly whether Nightmare Ned was still on when Recess was starting or what, but it was all around that same time, as I recall. And then, Peter, I don't think you worked on it past the first season, as I recall. You went on to something else, right?
Just to be clear, though, I've never really had bad experiences with Disney. I know lots of people have, but, most of the stuff I've done with them has been really nice, I mean, not that the product was necessarily good or bad, but just the experience was always good.
Well, keep trying. You'll find. You keep doing it, Peter. You'll have some bad experiences. Don't worry.
Yeah.
You guys are killing me.
Anyway, so I guess we can.
You very well. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So Dennis, how did you come into Recess after working on Rugrats?
That was through Paul. I'm pretty sure Paul put the word in and called me, and it was a process. We went through a process, and then I came onto the show. It was great. It was kind of, for me, a growth from Rugrats. The storytelling, my favorite parts of Rugrats were the early. I worked on the first 150 or something episodes, 100-something episodes, and those were the episodes that these guys worked on. So it was an extension for me, a continuation, and quite fun and quite eventful, because the stories were great, and it was just, I kind of think it was an extension of it. Do you think that, Paul, or not?
Yeah. Well, the story for me was that when we did Rugrats, we hired Mark Mothersbaugh to do the music for the show. And what I didn't know at first, it took me a couple of years to figure this out, is that Dennis was very instrumental. I didn't even know Dennis. I'd never met him. But he was instrumental in putting the music together kind of behind the scenes. And
Mark Mothersbaugh made me go to the other room when you came over.
He locked you in the basement.
Right.
Yeah, it was like, oh, Paul's coming over. Go to the other room. Yeah,
but eventually, Dennis and I met toward the end of Rugrats, and we became kind of good friends. And it became clear to me what Dennis had done on Rugrats, and how much of what I was happy with about the music on Rugrats was Dennis. And then when it was time to do Recess, I wanted to get Dennis back on to do my new show. And it was a little bit of a fight, because Disney had a funny way of doing music, kind of an old-fashioned way of putting music together that was not using, what do you want to call it, an emulator, using an electronic keyboard to produce the music.
Well, it was, the way Disney liked to work was because of orchestras, the cost of orchestras. It costs a lot more to do it their way, no matter how you looked at it. They wanted to do shows by recording a bunch of music in advance and then cutting in the music for the show. And Paul and Joe wanted the music to be written for each episode uniquely, originally, at that moment. And the best way to do it is with, which the way everybody works now, is that I was very heavy into it back then, is with a computer and a lot of synthesizers and samplers, and you could create a whole score without having a whole orchestra in the room. It's a lot more work, but you can figure out how to do it. And that's what was somewhat groundbreaking with Disney. They weren't comfortable working that way, but then it saved money actually in the long run, and Paul and Joe got the storytelling that they liked. And there was a process as well with the management there. There was some at Disney. It was like a shift in the way they like to work, and it was actually quite good. It's the way they work now, pretty much, So it's a different world, and those guys wanted to continue working the way they worked with Nickelodeon, and actually got their way. It was good,
Yeah, and finally, last but not least, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say, what? That's an interesting point what you're saying too, Dennis, because I think fairly certain that Recess was one of the last shows that was doing a lot of stuff by hand, including music. Everybody was moving over to just purely, sampling music and and doing things like, everything on the computer. And then the Flash was going to come in, and all these new animation techniques were going to come in. And we, at the beginning of the show, we were still drawing on cells, it was still being painted in Asia, and even things like having, at the beginning, it was all timing, and it was traditional, and then, and including music, and also the way Paul records voices, he was coming from, from Gracie, from, Jim Brooks's period, era, and so he was always trying to put people together in the booth, if you go now to, Courtland can talk about this. The way most voice acting is done is one guy gets in the booth and runs through all his lines real quick and then does it 2 or 3 times, and then they cut it together. But Paul was really into always trying to get people, like, getting 2 actors in or reading with the actor in the booth if the other actor wasn't able to be there, so that you have a performance. You're trying to create a performance. And by the end of the show, by the time we got to be making the movie and stuff, things were becoming digital, for example. Like everything was, things like everything was getting drawn on the computer and stuff like that. And so it was interesting because a lot of technology was changing as that show was happening, I feel like,
Right. At the end of the show, the images were, as I recall, we were still drawing, the way that they did animation traditionally. Well, by the 1970s, say, they were drawing on paper, and then they would Xerox that onto a cell, and then they would paint the cell by hand. And that's what we were doing when we started Recess. By the end of Recess, we were still drawing on paper, but instead of Xeroxing it onto a cell, they'd scan it into a computer and paint the images digitally. So that was, and now they don't even draw on paper at all. They're just drawing right onto a device, some kind of a tablet, and then that goes into the computer, everything, so that there's never the analog moment where like something exists on a cell or a piece of paper or anything.
And you know what?
So in many ways, I feel like Recess was still sort of it had a feeling of being really handcrafted and personal, and we tried to let that happen as much as we could in every department. I mean, it's too bad you weren't able to get like Chuck Sheets or Howie Parkins or some of the artists in, or Eric Keyes, because those guys could tell you from their perspective what it was to draw the show, and those guys are all still working in TV animation, and they can tell you, it's not the same. They don't do that kind of hand created stuff quite the same way. Paul said they draw it onto the computer, but it just sort of changes things. And I feel like the music, what Dennis was saying, was sort of similar. I mean, a lot of the things were being done on the computer. I'm not saying that, but you had this feeling like when a scene was approached, Dennis was actually looking at it and saying, okay, and Dennis would take a run and say, I think this should have strings and it should come in here and it should be like that. And they would do like a scene at a time, and they'd say, yeah, that's good, or let's have a parody of this kind of song here or whatever. But the way music was even being done then was just computerized library of, we recorded all this music and now we're going to use this from here and use this from here and just kind of doing, and I think that's the same, Courtland can talk about the acting. I mean, we really tried to have then we also had real kids playing the parts. Courtland, I don't even know how old you were when you played Gus. How old were you?
Gosh, this was 97, and I got brought on actually a little bit later. I was a late cast, and I was working, I think on, I think it was also Nightmare Ned, Oscar's Atlas, so I had to be about, 7 or 8, when I started this. So, I mean, I was fairly young.
Was it your real voice? Like, or were you acting like a...
No, that was me.
My God.
I can confirm that. That was part through. Occasionally, somebody will hear me and be like, it kind of sounds familiar. My nasally tone. So, yeah, I mean, like Joe was saying, honestly, my favorite part about it was just working with everyone on this project was the best, and actually being in the booth with other actors, and you can kind of feed off them a little bit.
So how did you learn
me and Joe sat in a booth, me, Paul, Joe sat in a booth, and we went over my lines, and louder, stronger, bigger, bring it down a little bit, always switching it up, but it was really, really just a fun, enjoyable experience. One of the highlights of my childhood, for sure.
So I want to ask you, Courtland, so you were brought in a little bit later to the cast compared to the others. Now, were you auditioning just for Gus, or did you audition for other characters?
You know what? I don't remember exactly. And I talked to my mom about this. I was like, listen, did I audition for it? And if I remember correctly, I think I was just brought on. I was working on a couple different projects, one of them being Nightmare Ned, and then Oscar's Atlas. And I think I just started because Gus actually comes in a little bit later. He's the new guy.
So I think I can speak to that a little bit. So, but you did audition, Courtland. I don't know if you remember.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure. But, it's been 20 years, so I'm like, oh.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you the story. See, originally we had always considered that the cast would be 6 characters. But in the very first episode, in the pilot episode we did, which was called The Break-In, that first episode didn't have Gus. He wasn't in the episode. And we recorded that and made an animatic and tested it with kids before the show was picked up. So the character Gus wasn't in the original cast, right? So then later on, we knew we were going to have this character, but we brought him in on the second 11-minute episode of the first show. Does that make sense? So there were 2 11-minute episodes. He came in the second one. But that was recorded way, way after the first episode. So that's why he was a new cast member.
Okay, yeah, that sounds very interesting.
Thank you. better memory than me.
So yeah, I'd love to know from all of you guys. So, what were your favorite episodes of the show? Either that you guys were writing, or that you guys can recall on, like, working behind the scenes. So yeah, Paul, Joe, I'd love to know from you guys. What were your favorite episodes of the show?
Joe, that's
can I tell
one.
this one?
In the first season, there were quite a few that I really loved. And I don't know why, because they're early on and they're close to you, I suppose. Until things kick in. But then later, the show really started kicking. Really started hitting its pace, and a lot of other people started writing shows. So. And they are amazing. Like, one of my favorite ones. Well, Bart did one, for example, where didn't you do the one about the having your picture taken at school, and is he going to keep his clothes clean? And it's like a war movie. Will he make it through recess to get his clothes clean? Wasn't that one of yours, Bart?
Yeah, it's called And One Stayed Clean. It was originally a freelancers episode, and they turned in their draft, and I was like, well, what if we do this with it instead? So I kind of totally rewrote it. It was one of my first scripts on the show, and it actually, to this day, stands out in my mind as one of my personal favorites of the ones that I wrote. Although I have a couple others from the show that I really like, that I look at and I think, like, well, I never could have written that. Those are the things that I tend to appreciate the most. Like Economics of Recess, I love that because it's so sophisticated yet so accessible at the same time. It's a great show. It's where the show there's like a sticker economy on the playground. You can't use the swings without a certain number of mom stickers, I think they were called. And TJ gets sucked into this like immigrant's journey where he becomes he like craftily works his way up the ladder of society. He becomes this big sticker mogul on campus till everybody hates him, and then the economy crashes. I thought that was a really clever episode, and I just watched that and I was like, wow! I don't even know who wrote that one. It might have been Bill, or it might have been a combination of people.
One of the things that's great about the show is that there are so many episodes, and they were all so different, and they all took the show in different directions, and kind of it felt like a complete world, because in fact it was the reflection of a whole bunch of different writers, each one kind of taking the show in a direction he wanted to go. So Joe would kind of see to it that they all felt like they all had a common voice.
From the very beginning, because you could anybody, like, for example, I know. We had Holly Huckins, who we couldn't get her on the call today, but like she really ran with certain things about what it was to be a girl, on the playground, because most of us were boys. We were writing this kind of like, we wanted a show that would be both boys and girls, and she did one called First Name Ashley about how the girl, the toughest girl turns out to have the name Ashley, which makes her part of the Mean Girls. And it's like, we did Mean Girls long before Mean Girls, it's a cool episode. Or there's another episode I loved called The Voice, where, Mikey sings with the voice of Pavarotti, which is a really funny episode. And there's one called The Box that I loved, where which is about a playground box, or a punishment that's created. And that one, what happened was we interviewed some kids, and these kids told us, on our playground, when you get in trouble, they throw you in a box. And we were like, what? We thought it was like Cool Hand Luke or something. They threw him in a box and locked it up and let the heat burn him. And these kids are like, yeah, that's what they really do. And we're like, oh my God. And then as we were talking to them, we realized, no, it's just a painted square on the ground. And we thought, oh my God, these kids act like it's this prison movie. We thought, let's play it like a prison movie, And so we did that one. That's one of my favorites. And I know one of Paul's favorites is The Experiment, where Spinelli and PJ kiss for the first time. And that's there's just a lot of different ones. And then later there was one that was there was one that I loved. That the other thing that started happening is we started being able to do real parodies. Like there was one that was a kickball episode where what do you call it? Dodgeball City, which we did like a Western with Courtland as with Gus as the guy who was the great gunfighter, and that's a fantastic one too. There's just a bunch of them. There's a whole bunch of great episodes, and people could just run off in different directions and really have fun with it, and it still felt like the show because it was a big world of characters,
Okay, I have one I remembered, and I think Joe wrote it. Maybe Paul and Joe did. It's Gus's father. There's a speech about the war. What's it? Do you know what I'm talking about?
You're talking about the bully episode. That's a Joe special.
Yeah. That was a really good one. But that speech was awesome.
And that's the other thing that I was going to say too. It's like, I remember writing that speech, but that wasn't my episode. I think what happened a lot in that show, which I really loved, is we had a great writing room. And so you would have, people would come in and they would write, like, I feel bad, Bart feels like we rewrote his script that much, but usually what was happening is you would have an idea, we'd all work it out together, then somebody'd go off and write it, and then it would come back, and then we'd all be giving notes and changing it, and especially if you were a freelancer, you felt like I wasn't involved in the mix. But usually, if you were a staff writer, you got to be, you kind of had your hands on a lot of different scripts, and you got to be I felt like it was a good team, where everybody kind of worked together to make the shows better. And I think also that followed through all the way through the visuals and everything. I mean, I feel like those. I remember walking over and through the area where all the storyboard artists were, and they always just felt like it was a real team feeling, a real family feeling. It was a great show to work on that way. Yeah,
it achieved a new level of excellence by that teamwork. But I remember like that episode was an example of a father and a son relationship. And you had Spinelli and her parents, and really, you as writers, you guys delved into. It wasn't typical animation fare, and it stands on its own still because of that. Great stories,
And then there were episodes like Bart's talking about that were sort of intellectual. I mean, I felt like we had genres, The one that you're talking about, Bart, the Economics of Recess, actually was written by Rick Gittleson, who was another guy. We, was just a freelance guy, but then we rewrote it in the room. But that was a great episode. But it was kind of like an intellectual, sort of philosophical episode, I felt like. There was another one called The Story of Womps, which was about the kids making up a word, that instead of a curse word, since they got in trouble for cursing, so they made up a word. All these kind of, and it became this thing where they end up going to, to the city, the mayor ends up coming in and saying, this is not right. It becomes like a court case over the word, and it becomes this whole sort of philosophical discussion about,
Joe, I remember
what is
a story about that episode.
And you're like, wow, we could do that, and then we could do a story about a kid and his dad, and we could, that's what I liked so much about that show. I think that you could do all of those crazy things, and they were all 11-minute stories, so the next one was going to be a different one,
What you were saying something, Paul. What were you going to say about that?
Well, what I was going to tell is there's a funny story, and Bart probably knows more about this than I do, because I remember it was happening at the same time I was working on the movie, so I wasn't that involved with the episode. But what had happened was the writers together had come up with this idea that when TJ gets mad, he can say, "That womps," and it was a fictitious curse word. It was a curse word we made up, right? And we used it for a few episodes. And then all of a sudden we started getting notes from Disney. You can't use the word womps because it sounds like it represents the word sucks, and you can't say sucks. And I said, but we're not saying sucks. We're saying this other word. And they said, well, you got to stop. You got to stop doing that. We had this big argument, and the story of womps, that episode, comes out of that argument. Isn't that right, Bart? Isn't that how it went?
Yeah, that's true. I think Mark Drop came up with the word wants to start with. And then I guess after they actually did the episode, the S&P person attached to the show who originally had the objection was actually happy with it. And Disney overall, ABC were happy with it. And I think Barry Blumberg at one point wanted to use the word as part of one Saturday morning's signature saying, like Womps. It was going to be like Womps Saturday morning or something. We're like, dude, that's not, like, Womps basically means sucks. It means it really sucks. But it was being used as some, like, cool catchphrase that meant anything, like, neat or cool. It was a bizarre turnabout from the way that thing started off.
Just shows you how things can go in the wild world of children's television.
How about you, Courtland? What were your favorite episodes of the show, whether it be like with Gus or just in general?
Well, you know what? I still get people that, if they understand that I was in recess and whatnot, they'll always, tell me about. I always feel like it's one episode in particular. It was when they find out that Gus was this dodgeball champion. And he goes by the name of El Diablo, but he had this issue to where and you guys might have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he hits somebody with a ball, a kid or something like that, and he's too scared to come to the playground, so he swears it off, right? That was. I still have people that come up to me. They're like, "Hey, El Diablo,"
That's great.
Sorry,
That's so cool.
The hypnotist. I don't know if you remember this one, but when Mr. Prickly turns into, I think it's like a hypnotist or somebody turns Principal Prickly into like a kid.
Yeah, hypnotizes him.
Always one of my favorites because you have this character. Is an authoritative character, and you get to kind of see him on this different level with the kids. So there were so many episodes. I feel like we did a million. So even Womps too, just like you were saying. When TJ's trademark dirty word, I think we were even saying it in the studio. If we had. Oh, I don't get to work with so-and-so, that womps,
What about the word tender? Where did that come from?
That's a Walshism, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a Phil Walsh special. Yeah, you like to put it in a lot of scripts.
So
I think too, we always have this desire. I think anybody who's writing on a TV show or in a movie or anything, they're trying to create a language for each character, so that when you're reading it, and also for the actor, so you don't go, well, that could be anybody's line, And so you're looking for words that you can attach to the different characters. And tender was something I think Phil Walsh said at some point. I think that's a word he liked to use. And Paul immediately was like, that's it. Paul has a good ear for this kind of stuff. So he goes, that's it. That's TJ's word, And so they just all started saying it, Right, Paul? Isn't that pretty close? Paul would go around. Paul to this day goes around saying tender. Paul does.
We do all these funny renditions, and it became like a thing,
I feel like the word salsa was tried out with a little bit less success.
Well, I think there was an episode of where they get a substitute teacher who used to be a member of Third Street School and used to say supple, and they tried maybe once or twice, but it didn't really stick compared to the others.
That's right. And that was actually thinking of that one was the one with Joey Lawrence in it. Is that the right one?
I think it may be. Yeah, he was the substitute teacher, and he was supposed to be the goofy guy.
And that was an interesting one because Andy Lawrence, his brother, was playing TJ, and Joey Lawrence, who was a pretty big, TV star at that point, wanted to be in the show, and his mom would bring Andy and so, can't you think of something for him? And so one day we were trying, somebody, I think Phil maybe, or somebody said, hey, I want to do a substitute teacher thing. And we thought, what if wouldn't that be interesting to have like this cool guy who was like TJ, and he's played by TJ's older brother, and there's a relationship. I think that's the one I'm thinking of. Maybe I'm getting it mixed up.
No, you're right, because there were 2 episodes involving a substitute teacher. One is with Mr. E, who was like this mysterious guy when Miss Whitman was sick.
Right.
And then the other one was when the substitute teacher was a cool teacher and everybody liked him, and then Miss Finster and Principal Prickly were like, no, you can't act like this. You can't act cool. We don't want you as a substitute teacher anymore. So, yeah.
But that was, I think, the one that was played by Joey's. And that was actually kind of a sweet session to go to because, here's this kid acting with his older brother who he really does look up to, and it was kind of nice, And again, the other thing that was kind of interesting, and I don't know if you remember this, Courtland, was, when we first started the show, and Paul can talk about this more, Paul's coming out of, working at Brooks and all that kind of stuff. That's how he's thinking of actors. And so he was always thinking of putting everybody in the booth together. And I think you were there for this, Courtland. We actually have some photographs of this where there were some early sessions where we would try to get like all the kids in the booth at once. And
everybody.
And the sessions people were like, what the hell are you doing? And we would say, go ahead. Let's get one take where let's get a good take where nobody's talking over each other. And then let's just do one where they're just talk, just do it. And there were some great scenes that way at the very beginning. But, it's not realistic to do it that way every time. But it was fun to get all the actors kind of knowing each other and working together. And it was, the people I remember at the sound stage were just like taking pictures because they'd never seen anything like it before. Do you remember that, Paul?
Paul, do you remember that?
Sure do. Yeah, it was. I really thought that it brought the team of actors together. So, we kind of thought of the whole show as, like, to the extent that we could, like a big team, like a family or a team. And it helped do that with the actors. And we did a lot of sessions that way. It gets a little difficult later on because of people's schedules. Getting everybody at the same place at the same time is kind of tricky. We do it when we could.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a lot of times to whereas, we would have, 6 or 7 actors within the recording studio at one time. And that's just fun. Being an actor and you're already in this, world to whereas you're not worried about blocking or you're not worried about your camera. You're not even really worried about your lines because you're essentially just reading it off a script. But at the same time, you can project yourself a little bit more. You can make it as big or as small as you want. And it was always fun to just kind of feed off your fellow actors because generally you don't really get a chance to do that. So I had a great time. Me, myself, Andy, Ricky, Ashley, very, very fond memories of just hanging out in the booth.
And one actual grown-up in that group. Anne Adlon, who played Spinelli. She was the only real adult in the group. So it was kind of fun. They're jolly and one adult.
Yeah.
The kid playing TJ would just turn into an adult, and all of a sudden he'd walk in and go, all right. And I go, oh, fuck!
Yeah, and I would always say, Paul, just use that dial. Just dial up the,
Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
The pitch. Dial up the pitch.
Some of the kids,
you can't just do it that way. But then the problem was that everybody really became their parts, and it was very hard to recast anybody anyway. You didn't want to, but also you just couldn't do anything about it. And so, I think with Ricky, didn't we do an episode where his voice changed or something like that? Did we do that with Ricky?
Ricky's voice started to change toward the end of the series, and it got very deep. And I think he actually manipulated his own voice up to try to make it work, and then we have probably goosed it a little digitally, and we were okay with it. But I don't think it would have gone on for another... I don't think we could have done a whole season that way. It happened toward the end of the last season that we did. I think that's right. Does that sound right?
Yeah, probably, because I remember in the first season, TJ was voiced by somebody else, and then later on you got Andy, and then, I think you got somebody else, but that was probably, much later on. But yeah, I do recall that, we even talked about this a few years ago when you guys were on my podcast, that one of the most difficult things about having kid actors was that you had to constantly change the voices, especially for the men, because they went through puberty and they came with their deep voice and stuff like that. Craig was also going through the same thing where he had to replace his, like Arnold was replaced 5 times, and I think I don't remember.
It's always a problem. You're right. It's not that big of a problem with girls. Their voices don't change as drastically, but with boys, it's a nightmare. Courtland was so little when we started that I think we didn't have that problem. And by the time we did Lloyd in Space, which was supposed to be about a 13-year-old, I think, Courtland, you were about that age. So
I was about that age. I really did. That was another great project I had a lot of fun on. And just working with, obviously, just the same, it was easy. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, I remember, I specifically remember, certain times where my mom was like, "Oh, listen, your voice is starting to change. Maybe you should put that up just a little bit more nasally,
It's not nice to fool Mother Nature, Courtland.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to.
I always look to you guys. Help me.
Yeah. So, I know that we're way past our time, and I'm very sorry. We had technical issues early when we were doing the podcast. So I guess we can start wrapping things up really quickly. So, let's see if I can think of anything else. So yeah, I guess one thing that I wanted to discuss about was looking back on Recess as a whole. As of the day that I'm going to be posting this, the show will be 20 years old, and I'm sure for a lot of you guys, whether you go out to panels or whether you go over to seminars for speaking to up and coming writers and people who want to work in the TV or animation industry, they always talk about Recess was my childhood. I was heavily influenced by that. So yeah, I'd like to know, in your opinion, what do you think looking back on it as a whole? So yeah, Paul and Joe, I'd love to know from you guys.
I don't know, Paul. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
The thing I think about Recess when I look back on it is, of all the shows that Joe and I have done, and we've done a few, the Recess was kind of notable because it when we look back on it, we've said to each other even recently, it was exactly what we wanted it to be. There was never a moment where we felt like, oh, the executives didn't let us do this or that, or that the artwork wasn't right, or any of those things that can happen. It felt like exactly the show we wanted it to be.
Yeah, that's well said, Paul.
So you guys had a good childhood. We all had good childhoods.
But and then the other thing about it too is, it is the 20th anniversary, and we as everyone knows, on this phone call, we're going to have a little get together with the crew and the cast and everything. And I also have such fondness for the people. It was a very easy group to work with. It was a fun group to work with. I think I work with a lot of these people to this day. Bart and I just worked on a show together, and I just feel like they're my great friends, because I think we had a really good time on the show, and we kind of mind melded on it, and I miss that, and that doesn't happen very often. I don't feel, so there's that additional fondness I feel for the show.
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, and like I said, this is my first job. Actually, my first job in scripted television, really. Before that, I was writing jokes. And yeah, I was writing sketches, but it wasn't really story and it wasn't really character. And I just kind of fell into this accidentally, but I fell into it really comfortably as well. These guys welcomed me with open arms, and it was a fantastic place to cut my teeth, not just on writing, but also on production, because they encouraged me to get involved in that. It felt like Joe says, it felt like family almost. And yeah, we had a lot of arguments, but they were always healthy arguments about making the show as good as it could be. And in the years since then, the landscape has changed. Branding has become really important for the networks to help create their little viewership niches. And so it's harder and harder for an original and individualized voice like what Joe and Paul came up with to really find a home. So I have really, really deep feelings of nostalgia about that show. It's probably my favorite experience in television.
Well, Well, it's so rare that you have the opportunity to work in such a collaborative environment, because most shows that I've worked on, it's been like me in a room by myself. They just don't have this large writing staff and just that whole collaborative environment. And I think working on both Rugrats and Recess, I really got spoiled for what a show could be. And I think the reason both of those shows are so good is because it was so collaborative, and it never felt rushed. I mean, we were pressed for time at times, but we always, doing the best show we could do was always the primary objective. And you don't get that very often.
Well, the other thing is, I think that nowadays what I'm seeing in animation is there's where the executives run things instead of the producers. So it's kind of run by the studio/network. Nowadays they're kind of the same thing. And they tell you exactly what they want, and if you don't give it to them, they either force you to change it to what they want, or they fire you and get somebody who will do it. And the days of where creators and producers and writers and directors and I hesitate to use the word, but the artists themselves get to make the show they want to make is kind of ended. Maybe it may be there in live action, but it's not. It's hard to find it in animation these days.
Right. How about you, Dennis? How is it different, when it comes to being as a composer for like TV and other projects? How do you look back on your work in Recess as a whole?
Well, it was a lot of fun because the stories were so great. But I was doing some other shows too that were pretty wacky, and I always felt Recess was my deeper work, my more serious, fun, like real life work. And the stories were great. And I had an interesting childhood in Sacramento, and Joe and I later found out that we lived in the same town, and some of the stories reminded me of my childhood, and I think it resonated a lot with me. I was in post-production, so I didn't see all these guys. I saw them once in a while, but the work was so clear. The stories were clear. I always knew what to do, and that's a rare treat. It was a great team effort, I believe. I think these guys nailed it.
Right. How about you, Courtland? You as an actor and you as somebody who genuinely loved the show as much as a person who would watch it on TV, like, how do you feel about it as a whole?
Well, me being a kid as well, I mean, I watched the show with my little sisters on the one Saturday morning, and that was, before Pokemon, so I got to, do both the series I wanted to see, but it was cool. I mean, I have very, very fond memories of working directly with the studio, at the studio, and then working with Paul and Joe. They've just been great. I couldn't ask for a better experience. I remember just even stories with me and Andy where we had time in between recording sessions, and we had gone over to another studio location and just kind of scouted their craft service table and decided that we were going to replace some of the fruit that we had at our table with some of the Snickers bars and like run it back. And I have relationships with a lot of the kids on the set as well. The whole writing team. I mean, just everything about it was a very, very wonderful experience, and I had one of the best times shooting because it was so different from most projects. Those would be like commercials or anything like that. Going to work was fun for me, especially as a kid.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
Joe definitely made it that way.
All right, well, I think that we can wrap things up. So, listen, guys, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sharing your stories and coming on by. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great.
Our pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much,
Patricia.
So, yeah, do you guys have anything?
Thanks for doing it, Pat.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming. So, yeah, do you guys have anything to share, like any upcoming projects that you guys like to talk about? Any, where can they find you at for, to learn more information about what you're doing? So, yeah, Paul, the last time that we talked, you were working on a Santa Claus movie. How's that coming along?
That died a painful death. The company
I'm sorry.
out of business, so we never did that project. But Joe and I have a project at Amazon. We can't talk about too many of the details, but it's a really exciting live action and with animation combination project that we're working on over there.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great. Can't wait. Anyway, so Bart, what are you working on?
We just wrapped the last script on a show I was story editing called Goldie and Bear. It's on Disney Junior. And I have a project in development at DreamWorks that I, too, cannot talk about because of the NDA I signed. And a couple of other possible irons in the fire, but nothing I can really discuss.
Sure, that's fine. Peter, do you have anything coming up?
I'm working on a show at Amazon, maybe with Bart, and and that's pretty much about it.
Sure, okay. Dennis, what are you working on?
I haven't been doing much television, mostly advertising lately, but I'm looking forward to see what Paul and Joe come up with.
Okay, great. All right, and Courtland, how about you?
You know, I removed myself from the industry a little while ago, and I've just been kind of inching my way back. I was involved in just some student films, and I'm now out in LA again. So, you know, just kind of dabbling just within just smaller projects. But, oh my gosh, I'm so happy to hear everybody. And, you know, it brings back fond memories, so...
That's fantastic. That should be it for this episode of Casual Chats. Let us know in the comments below about your fondest memory of Recess. How did you first get introduced to it? What were your favorite episodes? What are your favorite moments? That's it, everybody. Hope to see you around soon. Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
Drop your silver in my tambourine. Help a poor man build a pretty dream. Give me pennies, I'll take anything. Now listen while I play my green tambourine. Watch the jingle jangle start to shine. Reflections of the music that is mine. When you toss a coin, you'll hear it sing. Now listen while I play my green tambourine. Drop a dime before I walk away. Any song you want, I'll gladly play. Money feeds my music machine. Now listen while I play my green tambourine.